It's my great pleasure to welcome all of you to this G20 luncheon event, which is co-sponsored by the Centre for International Governance Innovation in Waterloo and the Canadian Council of Chief Executives. The purpose of this gathering is to shed light on some of the key issues and challenges that will be the focus of discussions at the G20 summit that's going to take place, as you all know, next month in the magnificent setting of St. Petersburg, Russia. We have a very distinguished panel of speakers who are going to kick off our discussion, and there is general agreement that there will be time to have a question and answer session with the audience afterwards. John Manley is going to introduce His Excellency Georgy Mammadov, so I will take my role as moderator to introduce John and his other co-panelist, Domenico Lombardi. John Manley, as you all know, very distinguished Canadian, President and Chief Executive Officer of the Canadian Council of Chief Executives. He's the former Deputy Prime Minister of Canada, first elected to Parliament in 1988 and re-elected 3 times. From 1993 to 2003, he was a minister in the government of Jean Chrétien, serving in the portfolios of industry, foreign affairs, and finance. He will be followed in our roster of speakers by His Excellency the Russian ambassador, and John will introduce the Russian ambassador. The ambassador will be followed by my good friend and colleague, Dr. Domenico Lombardi, who many of you will not know, but he just joined CIGI this summer as Director of the Global Economy Department. He is a very distinguished academic who has traveled extensively in policy circles. He serves as chair of the Oxford Institute for Economic Policy. I think most of you know that organization. It does terrific analysis on global economic issues. He's also a member of the Financial Times Forum of Economists and serves as editor of the prestigious World Economics Journal. Prior to joining CIGI, Domenico was a senior fellow at the Brookings Institution and served as a member of the executive boards of the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank. And I hasten to add, he also has a PhD in economics from Oxford. At the end of our session, Dr. Rohinton Medora will say a few words to end the session. As many of you know, he is the president of CIGI, became president after having served for many years on CIGI's International Board of Governors. Many of you here will know Rohinton as the former vice president of programs at the International Development Research Center, where he also led the micro impacts of macroeconomics, adjustment policies, and trade, employment, and competitiveness initiatives. At this point, I'd like to invite John Manley to come forward and say a few words. I would remind all of our speakers they have 10 minutes. We will be flashing a 1-minute sign when you get to the end. And don't take it personally, but I will wrestle you to the ground if you speak for more than 10 minutes, because we are on a very compressed schedule, and we do want to have time to engage our very distinguished audience here. Thank you, John.
Well, thank you very much, Fen. I'm going to endeavor to use less than the 10 minutes unless the senator heckles me, in which case things could get rather drawn out, and I'll ask you to wrestle him to the ground. Anyway, just really what I'd like to do in launching this discussion today is reflect on the fact that the G20 came into existence with some important role played by Canada in that occurrence, especially when it began as a grouping of finance ministers, largely dealing with the financial and economic issues. It became critically important as a forum for heads of government during and following the great financial crisis in 2008, 2009. I think the G20 became a very effective tool in dealing with some of the critical things that were unfolding at that time and coordinating action by governments and central banks in order to respond to those crises. But on a more general level, we've seen over the course of the last number of years some evolution. And when we hosted the G20 back in 2010 here in Canada, it was the task of the Canadian Council of Chief Executives to pull together some of the representatives of the business communities across the G20. I think virtually all of them were represented in some measure at the meeting that was held on the periphery of the G20 meeting. We had a great deal of time. We had virtually 2 hours with almost all of the finance ministers from the G20 countries at that time, meeting with the B20 in common meeting, and Prime Minister Harper, as host of the meeting, spent an hour with the delegates. And I say that to reflect on some of the themes that we raised as important considerations in 2010, and in putting forward some of the thoughts and concerns that the business communities generally are looking to the G20 to deal with this time around. I have to say that there's a lot of similarity to some of the concerns that were raised back in 2010. So I'm just going to touch very quickly on those. The other speakers, I'm sure, will have more to say about it, and then in Q&A we'll have an opportunity to discuss them further. First of all is restoration of promotion of the multilateral trading system. In Toronto in 2010, as in many other cases, reassuring words were issued by leaders about the commitment to concluding the Doha round, to continue to see progress on multilateral trade issues. And I think we all have to acknowledge that as we sit here today, the chances of seeing any near-term success in multilateral trade negotiations that are interregional are resting solely on the TPP and not very heavily on the WTO. It continues to be a cause for concern. The flip side of that coin, and the second issue, is the resistance of protectionism, and that was a common theme during the G20 discussions back in 2010. And I have to say that the results have not been hugely encouraging. If we look at the most recent WT report on G20 trade measures that was issued just in June, which covers the period between October and May 2012-2013, we find the G20 economies have continued to implement trade restrictive measures, so that in that period, which I guess would be about seven or 8 months, more than 100 restrictions were recorded over the review period, covering about 0.5% of G20 merchandise imports, or the equivalent of 0.4% of world imports. So it's great to have these communiques, which in my experience were often written by more people than read them, but there needs to be some action that follows up on the communiques and shows that they are meaningful. There's the WTO Trade Facilitation Agreement. Again, an important element that needs reinforcement by G20 leaders, especially on the verge of the next WTO Trade Ministerial Conference, which is approaching quickly. It's important for leaders to reaffirm their commitment to trade facilitation. Promoting international investment. Again, it's the recurring theme. It's something we talked about in 2010. Obstacles, barriers to investment continue to plague many of our G20 economies. It's again a flip side of protectionist measures. And I think we look to our government to lead in that regard in opening Canada to foreign investment, foreign direct investment. And finally, achieving sustainable fiscal policy. It was a theme again in 2010. Our organization has been heartily enthusiastic about supporting the government's efforts to get to balance in 2015. When in periods of growth, you have to restore fiscal balance so that you have the resources available to meet the needs of times when growth has been diminishing. So to fail to see the restoration of fiscal balance on the G20 agenda would be a recognition of the fact that we're in a continuing spiral which can only end badly. So from a business point of view, those are the key themes that we hope to see reinforced during the course of the meetings that will be held shortly in St. Petersburg, and they're very consistent with the themes that came out of the B20 meeting, which was held in advance of the G20 assembly. I asked actually for the opportunity to throw, as they say in the television business, the floor to Ambassador Mammadov, in part because he's cheerfully tormented me for many years, and it's an opportunity to torment him back. But I've known him for a long time. He first came to see us at the Pearson Building when I was the Minister of Foreign Affairs, when he was the Deputy Foreign Minister for Russia. He has a long and distinguished career in the Foreign Service, starting in the days of the USSR and continuing seemingly without interruption as a senior official in the Foreign Ministry of the Russian Federation. We connived together at the G8 Foreign Ministers meeting in Italy in 2001, when we had a number of common views on some important issues that were being debated. But if you talk to his former colleague, Strobe Talbot, now of the Brookings Institute, he was one of the toughest arms negotiators that Strobe had to deal with as they tried to count missile warheads and reach important negotiated agreements on reduction of strategic arms. A very distinguished ambassador for his country. He's also very distinguished in the Canadian environment where, despite, or perhaps because of our cold winters, he is now the Dean of the Diplomatic Corps, an achievement of longevity in these circles, which is very rare for representatives of major countries. And I know him to be a friend of Canada, and I think all of us, Yuri, are looking forward to your remarks on these or perhaps some other matters that may be of interest to you today. Ambassador Mammadov.
Thank you, John, for the kind words. I always wanted to repay them by calling you Prime Minister one day, but this is not to be. You never know, again. Never say never. I am dwarfed by the audience. It's very hard to impersonate Mr. Buffett or Mr. Trump when your taxes allow you only to address kindergarten management. But your foreign service showed us a great example recently by going on strike. So probably we should follow suit. Anyway, there is a certain advantage for a layman to address such a professional audience on economic matters, because over my years of dealing with international relations and, of course, with business community, I found out that though business people are richer, smarter than us, sometimes they're a bit naive about international relation and international environment, which leads them to some problems in some regions from time to time. So I think general background is conducive to discussing such an important matter as G20 and forthcoming summit in St. Petersburg. And just like John mentioned, I wasted 30 years of my life negotiating nuclear arms with the United States. So I know that peace is also commodity. And the price of peace is very high, not just of oil and gas and coal. Now we are living in a very turbulent times. There is a radicalization in many regions. Ethnic, religious, national conflicts are on the rise, and there is no concert or consensus against the main player, among the main players. This is certainly a problem, not just from mankind or for our countries, but for business community as well. And personally, I view G20 summit and the whole process of getting together and trying to find out way out of depression and other things also as an excellent and unique platform for leaders to get together, to surpass and overcome ideological, political and military obstacles, because I subscribe to what one president said, American president said, now it's very much about the economy, stupid. And not only in terms of production or employment or balancing budget, but also about international and domestic social stability. Because if you look at hot spots, of course you can analyze religious, historic and other trends, but there is something that unites them. It's a awfully bad living standards, lack of food, lack of water, lack of education, diseases, everything. And this is also about economy. So I believe that by conducting a successful meeting between leaders right now, we not only help to find way out of slowing down or recession, but we also help leadership of the important countries to get on the same page in sorting out the general world problems and difficulties that affect business communities as well. Every morning you can read a newspaper or whatever, and you will see that how stock exchange or oil prices react to what's happening in Syria or Afghanistan or Iraq or anywhere. So it's closely linked issues. What Russia believes should be priorities for this G20 summit? Very straightforward. Enhancing growth and providing for better employment. And we were quite transparent about that. We said from the very beginning that we were affected by the global recession and crisis in 2008. So we believe something should be done about that. And in this respect, I think the forthcoming G20 summit is going to be, to some extent, a turning point. Are we going to get out of the current slowdown in world economy or recession, whatever you prefer, each one on its own, by sticking to his own team or group of countries, by ignoring structural changes that should be effected in major countries, be it European Union or United States? Are we going to ignore the huge developing countries outside, giving them just, a pittance in terms of assistance during regular G20 or G8 summits? Or are we going to have such psychological change and understand that only by effecting very painful change together, we can turn the tide and confront the problems that were piling up since 1960s and even 70s, if you look back. I'm a great fan, not many of you probably are, of Mr. Greenspan, and when I listen to him and read some of his book, I understand that it all goes back to a large extent, and we can't just stress quick fixes to get out of the hole. So financing investment, financing growth, trying to affect the decisions that were already taken by G20 countries are going to be our priorities. We're not going to be, innovative simply for the sake of it because we're Russians and we want to be different. We understand that continuity and transparency in cooperation that was decided during previous hosts of G20 is very important. That's why we worked all this year and reminder of previous year very closely both with Mexico, former host, and we are working very closely with our successors in Australia. And I agree with John that sometimes all these communiques and papers are composed by more people than afterwards will read them, but the very process of getting the decision makers together, I think, is very important. And we are prepared to take a risk and be pragmatic, balanced, and not to take sides, because we know that this world is also a world of a huge economic competition. There is realignment of economic power. I won't stress on it. If you want to hear more, you can ask my friend, the Chinese ambassador. He will tell you a little something about changing environment, because China certainly is becoming one of the most important centers of global economic and political influence. But we believe that our task as a host is to be prudent and pragmatic. And in this, I think we share a little with Canada, because Canada, with all your ties and closeness and dependence on the American economy, is also looking for diversification. And Asia, Pacific Rim, including new trade alignments, is one of the goals of Canadian government as well. For us, it was never a challenge because part of our country is in Europe and part is in Asia. So actually, it's not a question for us. We will participate in all the open arrangements that will be conducive to our economy. We are very grateful that Canada and other countries, some of them are represented in this room, helped us to join World Trade Organization. So probably we're a little naive about those who criticize World Trade Organization and believe its time is gone and we must think about something else. We still think it's of some use, and this view will, of course, be promoted by Russian presidency in G20. And another thing, I believe that such meetings as G20 also help bilateral ties, not only because there will be bilateral meetings between leaders, because in preparation we share a lot together, and I know that with the Canadian government sometimes it was easier for us and is easier for us to find a common language on economic issues than on international issues. So it will also help us promote bilateral relations and create a web that will make, like I said, our priorities in terms of enhancing investment and encouraging employment more realistic. There is, of course, some new elements that we will introduce. You have an opportunity to get acquainted with them through materials that are widely available. I will only stress one thing that we also share, I believe, in Canada. Our belief in strong social safety net, whether it's crisis or no crisis. And that's why we introduced such a forum as meeting between labor ministers and finance ministers. And we think that it helps not only us and Canada to achieve realistic social economic parameters while balancing budget. By the way, we can risk some innovations because we have a balanced budget, and our sovereign debt is negligent compared to sovereign debts of others. But I think this social element is going to be important, and I hope that Australian presidency and others will try and also work on it. Again, I want all of you to thank for input you are making in through business channels, through political channels, in making G20 a success. We will try to make some difference with your help. We are all in the same boat. And more than that, we trust you enough to hire Canadian coaches to train some of our athletes for Sochi Olympics. But not hockey players, of course. Anyway, thank you very much. And as a token of my appreciation to you, I want to give you a little token of Sochi Olympics. By the way, this is the year of the white bear, if you know. United Nations are trying to protect them. So God bless G20 and protect it.
Thank you, Your Excellency, and I appreciate that both of our speakers have stayed within their time limits. So over to you, Domenico.
Okay. Thank you very much, Fan, for your generous introduction. I also feel very much dwarfed, standing in front of this very distinguished audience. If Ambassador Mamedov is dwarfed, think about how I should feel. So in the time have been allotted, I'll try to answer to three questions. The first is, why is the G20 important for the world? The second is, why is the G20 important for Canada? And finally, the third is a preview of what may be happening at the forthcoming summit in St. Petersburg. And also leveraging on the fact that I'm not an official, maybe I think that I can speak, a little bit more freely and more in a way sort of thought-provoking. So why is the G20 important for the world? I would say, first of all, the G20 is a forum of systemically important economies, of course, both advanced and emerging. And when the G20 leaders was established first in the fall of 2008 and then sort of institutionalized in the following year, that provided a very quick way of integrating emerging economies into a global consultative processes, into global decision making, and certainly much quicker than any revisions in the treaty of formal international organizations might have allowed. In fact, in November 2010, the G20 leaders did endorse an important package of reform for the IMF governance, and that has still to be ratified, just to prove this point. Number two, I would say informality. So this is the distinguishing feature of the G20. I think the ambassador was referring to the fact that the G20 does provide an opportunity for leaders to socialize, to exchange views. And therefore, the relationship between the G20 and formal treaty-based organizations, it's not an either-or relationship, but it's more a sort of complementary relationship. In fact, international organizations have to stay within their own mandate, and the formality of their own decision-making processes make those organizations a little bit slow in, act, change, and adapt. And this is certainly an important feature for of the G20. And thirdly, I would say really this is a key feature of the G20 vis-a-vis the G7, G8. The G20 is embedded in the Bretton Woods multilateral framework. And that was clear from the very first moment. Not only the heads of the Bretton Woods institutions are ex-officio members of the G20, but the G20 does have a structural relationship with all the international organizations, and in so doing, systemically important members do provide an infusion of political capital to international organizations. Never happened in the history of the IMF that the managing director could regularly consult and speak about issues of relevance to the IMF with the Russian president, the Chinese premier, the US president, the Prime Minister of Canada. And I think by doing so, even if we don't observe a tangible outcome, but the very fact that they are speaking, they are socializing, and they're exchanging views, I think this is an important pillar for the legitimacy and effectiveness of the overall international architecture. So the second question, why is the G20 important for Canada? Well, that's, I would say, a very easy question. Essentially, Canada is a very open economy. Its own exports are about 1/3 of GDP. And therefore, Canada has an interest in a well-functioning global economy, as well as in the associated governance arrangements. And the ambassador was recalling the fact, John Manley was recalling the fact that Canada did have a very important role in establishing the G20 and was actually the founding chair. So finally, in terms of the issues that we should expect in St. Petersburg, I don't really have a crystal ball, but I'll try to make my own preview of the issues that I think we are going to find in the communique. First of all, differently from the previous summits, the Cannes summit, the Los Cabos summit, clearly I don't expect any immediate sort of deliverables. At the Cannes summit, the Eurozone crisis was taking center stage. At the Los Cabos summit, we had several G20 and non-G20 members pledging $500 billion resources to ring-fence the spillovers from the Eurozone crisis to the rest of the global economy by providing additional firepower to the IMF. So clearly the situation has stabilized, not solved at all, but certainly stabilized. So certainly there is not this sense of urgency. And therefore, I think what we're going to see is really two things. The first is that there will be a broader spectrum of issues that the leaders will be discussing. And I think the Russian ambassador has already referred to that. If we go back to the communique of the finance ministers of the G20 when they met in July, I think that does provide a very good guidance in terms of the breadth of the issues that leaders will be discussing. Second point, I think there will be, we will see a number of sort of commitments or policy intentions that will have a sort of medium-term type of character, in sense that they will be discussing a lot the drivers of growth, so how to increase the rate of potential growth, how to increase employment. The IMF has estimated that by pursuing collective action, the world GDP would be higher by 2.5% by 2017. And concerted actions would generate more than 30 million jobs, roughly 1/3 in the advanced economies, the remaining 2/3 in the emerging and developing economies. So the payoffs are really huge. And therefore, there will be this, certainly there will be a lot of reference to the need of structural reforms. I think this is a positive element also because it underscores a switch from the politically charged current account rebalancing tone of the earlier G20 summits, and therefore, not that the economics of the G20 has changed in any way, but I think it's fair this focus on structural reforms, especially labor, product, market reforms as drivers for medium-term growth. We will see, I think, developments in terms of consensus on the fiscal policy framework. Clearly, so far, there was a kind of, division within the G20 between those who were in favor of tighter fiscal policy stance, or in favor of committing to some targets in terms of debt to GDP ratios to underscore this commitment to reduce debt. And on the other hand, there were some other countries, like, say, the United States, but not just the United States, who favored a more flexible stance, especially as they were getting out from the crisis. So I think, different from the other G20 summits or communiques, we're going to see more sort of a language of compromise at the price, however, of not having, of not agreeing on commonly applicable quantitative fiscal targets. So I expect more an emphasis on countries committing to reducing their debt to GDP ratios over the medium term, but based on, of course, on their national economic strategies, but without necessarily committing to specified targets. And one final point, when the G20 leaders was institutionalized, clearly the IMF was an international organization that was really, I would say, at the basis of many of the concerted official actions and recommendations coming from the G20. There is this package that has still to be ratified, and therefore I doubt that the G20 will engage heavily again on a discussion on IMF reform. Clearly there will be a reference, there will be a mention, but I don't think that the G20 will engage in the next package of IMF reforms that is formally due by January of next year, as it did in crafting the consensus for the previous package that, as I said, has still to be ratified. With that, I hope I have stayed within my time limits, and thank you very much for inviting me.
It just remains for me to invite CIGI President Rohinton Medhora to thank our speakers.
So in wrapping up, I should say that we've seen the range of views and issues involved, which in many ways is symbolic of what the G20 has to deal with. The G20 in all its incarnations was born in crisis, first as a forum for finance ministers and central bankers in the late 1990s, in the aftermath of the East Asian and Russian crises, and then as a forum for leaders about 5 or 6 years ago. In the process, what we've dealt with is the move of the forum from being crisis management to something more. And in that something more, we also have to think about the spectrum of issues that any forum can realistically deal with. And there were some questions that I thought brought that up quite well. In the CIGI set of commentaries on this year's G20 that's on your way out, the same views are expressed. I mean, does managing the global economy include having to do something about climate change or the internet? And there's a wide view reminiscent there. And in fact, it is the prerogative in the G20 system of the host country to set the agenda. It is also the case that the G20 is not simply summits, but there's now a deepening and a fleshing out of the process. One such example was the business community that John Manley represented. And there's now a B20-ish forum almost every year, as there is a collection of think tanks, the Think 20, of which CIGI is a part. And so Dominica was right in saying that the G20 is not a summit, but it's about how the world and all its communities are learning to engage in this much more globalized world. So I'd like to take this opportunity to thank our panelists, John Manley, Ambassador Mammadov, Dominica Lombardi. Fen, thank you for such capable chairing and management of the event as well. And thank you all for making it happen and for your questions, and looking forward to seeing you at the next one.